Right now, Apple generates more than $416 billion in annual revenue. Its services division alone, the App Store, subscriptions, licensing fees, brought in $109 billion in a single fiscal year, at a gross margin of 75.4%. That is not a technology company. That is a money-making machine. But, in 1997, Apple lost more than $1 billion. Its product line was a mess. Its operating system was falling apart. And Steve Jobs later said the company was roughly 90 days from bankruptcy. The comeback did not begin with a brilliant new product. It began with a decision to cut almost everything. This is not the story of a visionary genius. This is the story of a company that learned, through failure, that control is more valuable than innovation. Part 1. The early-edge Apple was founded in 1976 by Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne. The Apple II launched the following year and became the company's first real commercial hit. It was well-designed, approachable, and modestly successful. But what turned it into a business essential was not the hardware. It was a piece of software Apple did not even build. In 1979, VisiCalc launched. It was the first spreadsheet program, and it ran on the Apple II. Overnight, the Apple II stopped being a hobbyist machine and started being a mandatory business tool. Finance departments needed it, accountants needed it. The hardware created the possibility, the software created the demand. That dynamic, where Apple controlled the hardware and third-party software unlocked its commercial potential, would define the company for decades, sometimes as an advantage and sometimes as a liability. By 1980, Apple was growing fast enough to go public. In December of that year, the company's IPO valued it at almost $2 billion. It was the largest public offering since Ford in 1956. Apple was not even 5 years old. The early lesson was clear. Packaging technology into something usable and desirable was a business model. The harder lesson was still coming. Part 2. The Macintosh Warning. In 1984, Apple launched the Macintosh. The 1984 commercial aired once during the Super Bowl and became one of the most analyzed pieces of advertising in history. The product itself was genuinely revolutionary. A graphical interface, a mouse, a computer designed around how people actually think rather than how engineers program. It cost $2,500. It did not sell the way Apple expected. The Macintosh was ahead of its time in ways that hurt it. The hardware was underpowered for what the software was trying to do. The price locked out most of the market. And critically, the software ecosystem was nearly empty. A computer is only as useful as what you can run on it. Apple controlled the hardware beautifully and the software ecosystem barely at all. Inside the company, things were worse. Jobs clashed with CEO John Sculley over strategy and operational control. In 1985, Jobs lost that internal power struggle, was stripped of his responsibilities, and resigned in September to start a new company called Next. Apple had proven something important and painful. You can build the most interesting product in the industry and still fail commercially if the ecosystem around it is not ready. Control without ecosystem support is a trap. Part 3. The Breaking Point. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Apple kept its position as a premium brand, but strategically, the company was drifting. The Macintosh product line expanded into a tangle of overlapping models with names that meant nothing. Performa, Quadra, Centris. Customers could not tell the products apart. Retailers could not explain them. The lineup existed not because customers needed it, but because Apple's internal divisions kept pushing variations through the pipeline. Meanwhile, Windows was closing the gap. Microsoft's operating system was good enough for most users and ran on hardware from dozens of manufacturers competing on price. Apple was selling premium products into a market that was rapidly deciding premium was not worth it. The most critical failure was internal. Apple had been trying for years to modernize the Mac operating system through a project called Copland. By 1996, it was clear Copland was not going to work. The project was canceled. Apple had no viable path to a modern OS. In December 1996, Apple agreed to acquire Next for approximately $427 million. The deal brought back Steve Jobs and, far more importantly, brought Apple the software foundation it would eventually build Mac OS X on. Apple had to buy its future operating system from the founder it pushed out a decade earlier. In August 1997, Microsoft invested $150 million in Apple in exchange for non-voting shares and a commitment to continue developing Microsoft Office for the Mac. Apple was sitting on roughly $1.2 billion in cash, so the money was not the point. The point was the signal. Microsoft publicly backing the Mac platform told the market the platform was not dead. That credibility was worth more than the check. Apple reported a loss of more than $1 billion that year. The company that had once been the most exciting name in computing was now a cautionary tale. Part 4. The tactical pivot. Jobs was named interim CEO in 1997, and his first major move was not a product launch, it was a deletion. He canceled most of what Apple was working on. The bloated product matrix got replaced with something almost absurdly simple: a two-way grid, 2 axes, consumer and pro, desktop and portable. 4 products. That was the entire lineup. Everything else was cut. This was subtraction as strategy. By forcing the company into a tight product grid, Jobs eliminated the internal politics, the redundant engineering, and the customer confusion that had been draining Apple for years. The company could now focus its resources on doing 4 things exceptionally well. In 1998, the iMac launched. Translucent plastic, bright colors, a single cable. It did not look like any other computer on the market. It gave Apple a consumer identity again. In 2001, the iPod launched. In 2003, the iTunes Store followed. Together they demonstrated something new. Apple could control not just the device, but the entire distribution channel for what the device was used for. You did not buy music from a record store and put it on your iPod. You bought it from Apple. The device and the commerce layer were one system. The iPhone arrived in 2007. The App Store followed in 2008. The pattern was now fully established. Apple made the hardware. Apple controlled the software. Apple operated the marketplace, where third parties could reach Apple's customers. And Apple collected a cut of every transaction. In 2007, the company dropped the word computer from its name. It was no longer describing what it made. It was describing what it had become. Part 5. The financial payoff and the modern risk. The business model that emerged from those years is now one of the most profitable in corporate history. In fiscal year 2025, Apple generated $416 billion in total net sales. The iPhone remains the largest single product category, but the more revealing number is services, $109 billion in revenue at a gross margin of 75.4%. Compare that to Apple's hardware products, which carried a gross margin of 36.8%. Every dollar of services revenue is almost twice as profitable as every dollar of hardware revenue. The iPhone is not the product. The iPhone is the front door. The product is the ecosystem behind it. The App Store, Apple Music, iCloud, Apple TV+, Apple Pay, and the licensing fees collected from companies like Google, just to remain the default search engine on Apple devices. The hardware creates the customer. The services extract the value. This is what vertical integration actually means at scale. Apple does not just make phones. It controls the chip inside the phone, the operating system running on the chip, the store through which software reaches the phone, and the payment rails that process transactions inside that store. Every layer generates margin. Every layer reinforces every other layer. But that same structure is now Apple's primary legal liability. Regulators in the United States, the European Union, and elsewhere are actively targeting the App Store's fee structure and Apple's control over what can and cannot run on its platforms. The closed ecosystem that generates $109 billion in high-margin services revenue is the same ecosystem that antitrust authorities argue constitutes an illegal monopoly. Apple's greatest strength and its most serious vulnerability are the same thing. That is what absolute control looks like from the outside. From the inside, it looks like the most profitable business model in the history of consumer technology.